for the hardworking Canadians, investors and industries who are waiting for the Trans Mountain expansion to get built. Canada's Conservatives requested this emergency debate because on April 8th, Kinder Morgan set May 31st as a deadline to stop the challenges, settle the obstacles and provide certainty once and for all. But this wasn't the first warning that there were too many barriers and delays, that this vital infrastructure so clearly in the national interest is at serious risk. And for a year and a half since the approval, the Prime Minister has failed. Trans Mountain is crucial for Canada, a $7.4 billion initiative that will create 15,000 jobs directly and will sustain hundreds of thousands more in the energy sector across Canada and in all the other sectors that depend on thriving Canadian oil. The Conference Board of Canada says the combined government revenue impact for construction in the first 20 years of expanded operations is $46.7 billion, including federal and provincial taxes for public services like healthcare and education. BC receives $5.7 billion, Alberta receives $19.4 billion, the rest of Canada shares $21.6 billion. Municipal tax payments before adjusting for inflation total $922 million to BC and $124 million to Alberta over the first 20 years. It will provide necessary access to export markets for landlocked, environmentally and socially responsible Canadian oil, which is crucial now more than ever before since Liberals killed the only other two opportunities to Tidewater, the Conservative-approved Northern Gateway Pipeline, and Energy East, leaving Canada almost entirely dependent on the U.S., which is now Canada's biggest energy competitor. And without Trans Mountain, Canada will remain wholly captive, which is an acute problem because the U.S. is aggressively pursuing its own domestic energy production and supply while exporting crude oil for the first time in 40 years and flooding world markets. But it hasn't been built yet, and construction season is soon. It faces highly organized, ongoing, political, legal, and even foreign-funded opponents who promise they will still use every tool in the toolbox to stop it, death by delay. The Prime Minister's failure has forced innocent Canadians, businesses and families, neighbours and friends to be caught and at risk in the crossfire of an escalating trade war and even threats to restrict energy supply between three neighbouring provincial governments. Kinder Morgan's deadline is an alarming but predictable economic and constitutional emergency. It's a direct result of the Prime Minister's failure to act. Now it's about more than the pipeline itself. It's about investor confidence and certainty in Canada overall. Canada's international and economic reputation is at stake. That's because it's actually the latest in a pattern of multi-billion-dollar energy investments and projects cancelled under this Prime Minister. The reality is more Canadian energy investment has been lost under this Prime Minister in 2 years than under any other Prime Minister for the same time frame in 70 years. The total dollar value is like losing 75% of auto manufacturing and almost the entirety of aerospace in Canada. The collateral damage is hundreds of thousands of people losing jobs, families in turmoil and struggle on this Prime Minister's watch. What's scary is that it's the tip of the iceberg if the Liberals ramp through their new energy regulations, their tanker ban, their offshore drilling ban, their carbon tax, and more. Provincial governments, energy investors, economists, and oil and gas proponents are all rightfully demanding certainty and clarity about Trans Mountain and about the future of energy development and transportation in Canada. There's no firm commitment that barriers will cease. The Liberals will make it worse. Oil and gas provides billions in tax and royalty revenue to all governments, hundreds of millions to charities, and in partnership with academic and educational institutions across Canada. It directly and indirectly employs hundreds of thousands of Canadians in every part of the country and hundreds of thousands more in spin-off jobs. It lifts the standard of living of every Canadian. The escalating crisis over Trans Mountain is causing investors and proponents to speak out. That's rare, and elected representatives should take note. The CEO of one of the biggest midstream oil and gas operators in Canada, Keyera, says, quote, Canada is not looked upon as a good place to invest when it comes to oil and gas these days, partly because the U.S. environment is positive. CEO David Smith outlines critical priorities for Canadian energy: market access, competitiveness, and making sure government is, quote, not layering on additional costs that make it difficult to compete. The CEO of Suncor, the leading integrated oil and gas company in Canada and a pioneer in the oil sands, said, quote, we're having to look at Canada quite hard. The cumulative impact of regulation and higher taxation than other jurisdictions is making Canada a more difficult jurisdiction to allocate capital in. And, quote, other jurisdictions are doing much more to attract businesses, so Canada needs to do much more to up its game. Absent some changes, you're going to see us not exercising the very big capital projects that we've just finished. Upstream oil and gas developers are calling on the Prime Minister to ensure Trans Mountain can proceed. The CEO of Cenovus Energy said, quote, "If the rule of law is not upheld and the project is allowed to fail, it will have a chilling effect on investment, not just in BC, but across the entire country. Banks and investment firms are throwing up red flags. The Royal Bank says, quote, in real time, we're seeing capital flow out of the country. And, quote, if we don't keep the capital here, we can't keep the people here. Scotiabank says, quote, we're going to lose our competitive advantage on a number of things. Canada has a productivity issue and it has a competitiveness issue. And, quote, I'm concerned about the resource-based economy and access to tidewater. CIBC said, quote, slowdown or uncertainty regarding a pipeline is clearly a major factor impacting investment in the energy space. Among the most passionate are business owners in BC. The CEO of the Business Council said, quote, this is no longer about a pipeline, but on whether you can rely on government and the rule of law if you choose to invest. This can have lasting consequences. The Canadian Federation of Independent Business said, quote, if uncertainty is allowed to continue, it risks doing serious damage to this country's reputation. The BC NDP Green Coalition has been challenging federal jurisdiction aggressively, asking for more studies about the product that has been in the pipeline for decades, putting up roadblocks through construction and intending more if the expansion does get built. The Prime Minister obviously should have anticipated this attack, since they never supported it and openly campaigned on killing it, but he didn't even bring up the pipeline in his first call with the Premier. It's taken 10 months and a full-blown economic and constitutional crisis for him to meet about it with a project on the line. It's a crisis of the Liberals' own making. Now governments are floating the concept of taxpayers financing or backstopping it. The Prime Minister suggests the only way for Trans Mountain to be built is to nationalize or subsidize it, but before him, major energy projects and pipelines could be built in Canada with no risk to taxpayers, and the challenges won't stop. And it's a death knell for private sector interests and investments in the future. It's an indictment of his own record. Another aspect that makes Trans Mountain so necessary is the economic opportunities and social benefits for Indigenous communities now and for future generations. Trans Mountain is partly owned through equity partnerships with 43 communities along the route, worth more than $400 million. Every Indigenous community directly impacted by the expansion and within a 10-kilometre buffer zone all along the route supported. As of August 2015, 120 Indigenous entities were consulted. About 85% of the owners or occupants on the pipeline route raised no issues or concerns. Chief Ernie Cray of the Cheam First Nation said, quote, if this project doesn't go through, it will hurt our people. Arthur Baird, the chief of the Paul First Nation, said, quote, we have to support the development of the country and its economics because the economics of the country affect all of us in one way or another. In 2016, when the project was frozen waiting for approval, Mike Laborde, the former chief of the Whispering Pines Clinton Indian Band, said, quote, I want the money from our resources so that we can pay for our health, so that we can pay for our education, so that we can pay for our elders, so that we can pay to protect our environment, so we can build better pipes, we can build better bridges, we can build better railways. The Peters First Nation says, quote, we are concerned that among all of the well-funded and highly publicized opposition to the project, the voice of Indigenous nations that support TMX has been lost. Peters First Nation has lived with the original pipeline that was built over 50 years ago, seated at the base of our mountain and above our homes with no worries or incidents. The TMX pipeline is the safest way to transport needed natural resources out of our country for the benefit of all Canadians. Exactly. Of course, opinions of Indigenous people are diverse, and everyone has a right to advocate their views and to assemble peacefully. But it's quite the spectacle to see NDP and Green activists outright oppose economic opportunity and security for 43 Indigenous communities, while 7 challenge the expansion in court. It's stunning hypocrisy to hear politicians speak of this, quote, most important relationship and worry publicly about the crippling poverty and particular socioeconomic challenges and barriers facing Indigenous Canadians while deliberately using every possible means to block financial opportunities and undermine all their efforts and all their work to secure agreements to benefit their communities, their youth, and their future. It was already an embarrassment that Kinder Morgan had to announce to the world in January that it was still committed to the project. In spite of all the delays, the uncertainty, the prospect of failure, the enemies on all sides, it was still trying to get Trans Mountain built. The Prime Minister should be ashamed of his utter failure to champion it. But that's what energy investment in Canada looks like under this government and under the Prime Minister's failure of leadership. Energy is Canada's #1 private sector in the economy. It's Canada's second biggest export. Canada's pipeline monitoring system has the strongest safety standards in the world, and risk mitigation, prevention, protection, and response advances continuously. Canada is a global leader in energy innovation. Canadians must have industry to work, innovate, build, invest, and profit. And Canadians must also steward and protect the environment, air quality, water, land, and habitat. Canada is the most responsible developer of oil and gas in the world, and the world will continue to demand and need Canadian oil. The Liberals have got to champion Canadian energy, Canadian innovation, and Canadian jobs.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Surrey Newton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I come from British Columbia, over the last couple of days, I had more calls on one single issue that I have received a very positive response. Some of the things that the honourable member talked about, $46 billion in revenues, $7.4 billion project going through creating jobs for middle-class families. One thing that I would like to correct this member, that I have heard from my constituents, that this Prime Minister has shown a solid leadership on this issue, and he is the one that has clearly said that they are going to build this pipeline. When we talk about the previous Prime Minister, Mr. Harper, his policies were pitting one province against the other. This Prime Minister bringing provinces together, bringing Canadians together, and putting the economy in place. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that this is the only issue that I heard. There are more positive calls that this Prime Minister, member from Papineau, has shown the solid leadership, and I'm very proud of him.
Order. Members are unlikely to agree on some of these issues, and I expect members to show respect for this House and to listen and not be interrupting, as members were a moment ago during that answer. The honourable member for Lakeland.
Mr. Speaker, what the Prime Minister has done is repeated the same empty platitudes for a year and a half in the face of well-funded, orchestrated, organized, explicit, obvious, ongoing attacks. And the challenges will not stop. In fact, the anti-energy activists who are doing everything they can to kill the Trans Mountain expansion has promised that they will just keep going on and on and on. Now, we warned the Prime Minister of this. When the BC NDP coalition came to power in BC, we said contact that Premier immediately. He didn't. We said, lay out the plan, say specifically the undue and unnecessary delays that the Natural Resources Minister said they wouldn't accept. We said, define them. They didn't. We tried to move for an emergency debate in February. We weren't able to have it. We then instead moved for a motion that the Prime Minister would make explicitly clear to Canadians how the Trans Mountain expansion will be built. The Liberals voted against it. Every single one of them defeated Canadians getting to know what exactly they were going to do a year and a half after the approval, instead of just talking and talking and talking.
Honourable member for Edmonton Transcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank my fellow Albertan for her speech. It's always a pleasure traveling with her. I wonder if the member could speak to this issue. My understanding is in the last Parliament, under the Harper government, the Harper government actually commissioned a report by an expert on the Gateway pipeline. And the expert report said serious problems with moving forward with until we resolve the outstanding First Nation right and title issues. We now have the same concerns being raised about the Kinder Morgan. Does the member believe that whatever government is in power should be upholding their obligations under Section 35 of the Constitution and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and genuinely consult with and accommodate and consider Indigenous rights and interests in any project?
Honourable member for Lakeland.
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad that the member raises the Northern Gateway, because it's part of why the Trans Mountain expansion is so crucial right now. The Conservatives, of course, approved the Northern Gateway expansion, the Northern Gateway pipeline, which was the only new opportunity to Tidewater to export to the Asian Pacific. The Liberals could have, after the Supreme Court ruling and after the election, extended a number of months in scope for consultation, as they actually did with the Trans Mountain expansion. Instead, for the first time in Canadian history, the Prime Minister overruled consultant expert independent recommendation by the regulator, stopped it in its tracks, killed $2 billion worth of equity partnerships for 31 First Nations, ending hope for their communities, for their future, and all the social benefits and economic opportunities that pipeline would have provided to them, but also to the energy sector overall by diversifying market access. What is very concerning is what the chief of the Peters First Nation is saying, that natural resources, Indigenous communities' voices are being lost. So the Trans Mountain expansion is supported by the vast majority of Indigenous communities, and we should listen to them. They have been consulted. They deserve to be consulted. The Crown has a duty to consult, but the attacks against Indigenous people pursuing their own futures with resource development has to stop.